In the long, tragic history of civilizations, no concept is more fundamental to survival or more fatal in its absence than that of the border. A border is not merely a line on a map, it is the physical and metaphysical demarcation between the polis and the unknown, between the citizen and the foreigner, between the nomos, the law, and the primal chaos that lies just beyond the gates. The Greeks understood this. The Romans built walls not just to repel tribes, but to define the very point where Roman order ended and barbarism began. Once that line is erased, not by a conquering army, but by the apathy, the ideological sickness, or the moral hubris of its own guardians, the republic is already dead. It simply has not yet fallen over. What we are witnessing in the United States is not a policy debate. It is a dissolution. And the tragic physical proof of this dissolution has now materialized not as an academic thesis, but in the flesh and blood form of a national security nightmare: the arrest of an individual in Louisiana. According to the federal charges, this person is not merely an undocumented migrant, that therapeutic, meaningless euphemism invented by our own decadent elite who can no longer name reality. No. This individual is an alleged participant in one of the most savage acts in recent memory, the October 7th terrorist attacks on Israel. We must pause and dissect this fact. An agent of a massacre, an event defined by the methodical slaughter of civilians, allegedly lied on his visa application, was subsequently permitted entry into the United States, and then moved freely from Oklahoma to Louisiana. He was not a citizen, he was a foreigner, an alien whose loyalties, according to the charges, lie with an ideology hostile to the very civilization he had penetrated. He lived among us. He enjoyed the safety, the freedom of movement, and the protection of the laws which are the birthright of the citizen, all while allegedly harboring this blood-soaked secret. This was not a failure of the system. This was the intended result of a system that has been deliberately reprogrammed to fail. It is the logical end of a political doctrine that believes the enforcement of border law is a greater moral transgression than allowing the republic's potential enemies inside the gates. The Biden administration and its allies in sanctuary cities have created a tragic paradox. In their quest to create a borderless therapeutic utopia, they have engineered a paradise for predators. They have broadcast to the world that American law is optional, that American sovereignty is an antiquated concept, and that the distinction between the citizen and the non-citizen has been abrogated. And as history always warns, when you erase that distinction, the barbarian is the first to accept your invitation. The question then is how a great republic reaches this state of self-immolation. How do its institutions become so pathological that they cannot perform the most basic function of a state, to defend its own perimeter? The answer lies in a twin sickness: elite hubris and the collapse of legal order within the state. The Louisiana arrest cannot be understood in isolation. It is the mirror image of the chaos we have allowed to fester in our own cities. Before the external enemy could enter, the internal enemy, lawlessness, first had to be tolerated, and nowhere was this tolerance more grotesquely displayed than in the stasis that unfolded in Portland, Oregon. What happened in Portland was not peaceful protest, another linguistic perversion from the elite lexicon. It was stasis, the ancient Greek term for civil strife, the dissolution of the state into warring factions. For weeks, federal property, the very symbols of federal sovereignty, specifically an ICE facility, was besieged. Federal agents, the physical representatives of the laws of the United States, were attacked with projectiles, fireworks, and incendiary devices. They were trapped. They called for assistance, and here, in this moment, is the tragic crux of the collapse. The local constabulary, the Portland police, were given a stand-down order. They were told not to respond. The municipal government, for reasons of pure ideology, made a conscious decision to abandon their fellow law enforcement officers. This is more than political malpractice. This is the nullification of the social contract. The state, in the classical definition, is the entity that holds the monopoly on the legitimate use of force. In Portland, the local government did not just abdicate that monopoly, it implicitly ceded it to the mob. It chose the side of chaos against the side of law. They did this because they disagreed with federal immigration law. In doing so, they declared that the laws of the United States are void if they conflict with local progressive dogma. It is this exact logic that law is optional, that federal agents are legitimate targets, that institutions can be attacked with impunity, that created the very environment that allowed the Louisiana arrest to happen. If a city can declare itself a sanctuary and physically obstruct ICE agents, why, then, cannot the border itself be functionally erased? If federal agents cannot even defend their own building in downtown Portland, how can they possibly be expected to defend 2,000 miles of a southern border? The fall of Portland was not a local story, it was a national declaration. It announced that America was no longer a unified republic of laws, but a mere collection of feuding cantons, each with its own rules, some of which were actively hostile to the federal government itself. And when this dissolution occurs, when the state begins to eat itself, the tragic question arises: who restores order? If the local government cannot or will not protect federal property and enforce federal law, then who? This was the core question the Trump administration brought before the courts, and the answer came from the most unlikely of places, an answer that has shaken the foundations of modern political assumption. The Trump administration argued, correctly, that when civil order breaks down, when the institutions of law are under siege and abandoned by local officials, the president has the statutory authority and the constitutional duty to intervene. He can federalize the National Guard to execute the laws of the United States when regular forces are unable to do so. In other words, when the normal system is broken by lawlessness or local complicity, the executive must act, or the very concept of a union dissolves into meaninglessness. And then the unthinkable happened. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, long the bastion of judicial activism, a bench famous for advancing therapeutic social ideologies over the strict text of the law, agreed. In a 2-to-1 ruling, a panel of the Ninth Circuit lifted the lower court's injunction. It ruled that the president was acting within his authority. We must understand what this seismic event means. This is not a mere partisan political victory. It is a moment of tragic clarity. It is a progressive court, when faced with the naked, ugly reality of anarchy in Portland, being forced to abandon its therapeutic fantasy and return to the first principle of statecraft. They were forced to recognize that there is something worse than the exercise of executive power, its absence in the face of chaos. The majority opinion was careful and devastating. It did not say Trump could do whatever he wished. It said that after reviewing all the evidence, the reports of violence, the obstruction, the documented and intentional lack of local support, the president's decision fell within a range of honest judgment. That phrase is key: honest judgment. It is an admission that reality is tragic, that choices are hard, and that judges sitting in their safe chambers have no business micromanaging the crisis decisions of the executive. One judge in the majority, a Trump appointee, wrote flatly that he struggled to see how a district court could second-guess the president's assessment of executing the laws. He is correct. Judges are not proconsuls. They do not receive intelligence briefings. Their job is to interpret the law, not to manage a stasis in real time. There was, of course, a dissent. A Clinton-appointed judge clung to the therapeutic narrative. She argued the protests were small and non-disruptive before the troops were called. She chose the language of denial over the reality of the siege, but she was outvoted, and reality, for one brief moment, had won. This ruling is a profound rebuke, not just of the lower court judge, but of the entire sanctuary ideology. It reaffirms an ancient truth. You cannot have a nation if its laws are optional. You cannot maintain a republic if local prefects can pick and choose which federal laws to obey. The Portland siege and the Louisiana arrest are two heads of the same hydra. In Portland, local officials deliberately created a legal vacuum by refusing to cooperate with ICE. In Louisiana, we see exactly what slithers into that vacuum. The logic of the sanctuary city is a suicide pact. It assumes that all who flout our laws are noble victims. It is an adolescent therapeutic worldview, incapable of recognizing the existence of genuine, implacable evil. It cannot comprehend that some people, like the alleged actor in Louisiana, are not coming here for a better life. They are coming here allegedly after having just participated in the ending of life, and this is where the collapse becomes total and systemic. Because while this tragic reality of breached borders, of alleged terrorists living among us, was unfolding, what were the elites, the managers of the narrative, doing? They were lying. They were engaged in a sophisticated campaign of disinformation, not to protect the nation, but to protect the political viability of their own regime. The most glaring evidence of this intellectual and moral rot is found in the recent public interviews of the former White House press secretary turned commentator Karine Jean-Pierre. We must analyze what is happening here. This is not just a former functionary on a book tour. This is a representative of the elite class being forced to confront, however briefly, the chasm between their official narrative and the reality every sentient citizen can see. For years, her job was to stand before the nation and affirm things that were demonstrably false. She affirmed that President Biden was sharp, focused, and in command. She affirmed that the border was secure. She was the modern incarnation of a Greek sophist. Her job was not to convey truth, but to use language to obscure it, to make the worse argument appear the better. And now, after the undeniable cognitive collapse of Mr. Biden during the debate, after his functional withdrawal from the presidency, the interviewers, the very media class that was complicit in the cover-up, are finally tepidly asking the question. On CBS, she was pressed. You were in the inner circle. How could you say you never saw any cognitive decline? Her answer was a masterpiece of evasion. She stumbled, she deflected, she spoke of policy and challenging staff. But she could not explain why the reality she described was the precise opposite of the reality millions of Americans had witnessed with their own eyes. The most astonishing falsehood was her claim that she didn't really see him until after the debate, despite being on Air Force One with him on the way there. This is the pathology of language in decay. It is a statement so absurd it demonstrates a total contempt for truth, a confidence that she can say anything and her class will protect her. Then, on a podcast, a Democratic commentator confronted her. Let's be real. Biden didn't talk to the press. When he did, it wasn't very good. Again, Jean-Pierre had no answer because there is no answer but the truth. And the truth is the one thing her entire career was built to deny. Why does this individual failure matter? It matters because this specific dishonesty is the systemic dishonesty of the entire regime. If they will lie so brazenly, about the cognitive health of the president, a thing we can see for ourselves, why on earth would we believe anything they tell us about the border, a thing they are actively hiding from us? If they will lie about a disastrous debate, why wouldn't they lie about an alleged terrorist in Louisiana? The Louisiana arrest and the Karine Jean-Pierre interviews are symptoms of the same disease. The rot of an elite class that has convinced itself that maintaining its own power is more important than telling the truth to its citizens. They have replaced tragic reality with a therapeutic fantasy. And while they were telling us fairy tales, reality was walking across the border. This is precisely why the actions of Donald Trump, so reviled by our elites, resonate so deeply with a large portion of the demos. It is not about his tone or his style. It is because he, unlike them, appears to recognize the tragic nature of reality. When Trump speaks of mass deportations and securing the border, the media, the same media that lied about Biden's competence, portrays him as an extremist, a fearmonger. But how is it extreme when an alleged participant in the October 7th massacre is living in Louisiana? How is enforcing federal immigration law, which has been on the books for decades, extreme? The true extremism is the policy of the current administration. The true extremism is the deliberate non-enforcement of the border. The true extremism is the creation of sanctuary cities that actively obstruct federal law. Trump does not represent a new ideology. He represents a return to first principles. He represents the classical tragic view that national sovereignty is real, that borders are necessary, and that the first duty of a state is to protect its citizens from threats, both foreign and domestic. The juxtaposition could not be more stark. On one side, the therapeutic, lying elite who dissolved the border and told us there was nothing to fear. On the other side, tragic reality, now in handcuffs in Louisiana. The Ninth Circuit ruling was a late, reluctant admission that reality cannot be ignored forever. It was an acknowledgement that the principles of order and law are prerequisites for survival. Even a progressive court was forced to concede that when stasis breaks out in Portland, executive action is necessary. The question now is whether we, as a republic, will learn this lesson before it is too late. Is the Louisiana arrest a warning, a Sputnik moment that awakens us from our ideological slumber? Or is it merely another inconvenience to the narrative, to be buried by the next news cycle? The history of fallen republics is always the same. They do not die from a single blow. They die from 1,000 cuts, from the slow erosion of their laws, from the decadence of their elites, and from a fatal failure to distinguish the citizen from the enemy. They die when they forget what their borders are for.